Oh, good, pleasure. Oh, no.
Hi mate, I'm good. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats, we'll be starting in 2 minutes, please. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get back underway. As I said, we've got a very tight program here between morning tea and lunchtime. It's a great program, actually, and I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker here today, the Honourable Jason Clare. Jason is the Shadow Minister for Trade and Investment and also the Shadow Minister for Resources and Northern Australia. He was elected as the member for Blaxland in 2007, 2009. He was appointed Parliamentary Secretary for Employment in 2010, appointed Minister for Defence Material in 2011, was appointed Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Justice. And I know during that period I did a little bit of work with Jason and his department on fixing up some of the anti-dumping arrangements in Australia. Following the 2013 election, Jason was appointed Shadow Minister for Communications, and in 2016 he was appointed Shadow Minister for Trade and Investment and Shadow Minister for Resources in Northern Australia. So Jason will speak for 10 minutes or so, and then he's happy to take some questions. So a warm welcome to Jason Clare.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. Can I start by recognising the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and their elders past and present, and welcome everyone to Canberra. I understand the first session was very exciting and very interesting. I wish I could, well, there's some smiles. I hope that I'm gauging the room right. I know I'd rather be in this room for the rest of the day listening to the conversation than going down to question time anyway later on today. I think I'd learn more in here than I will down there. Bob Hawke's most savage criticism of his predecessor, Gough Whitlam, was that he said he knew about as much about economics as you could write on the back of a postage stamp and there'd still be room to spare. A little bit rough. Whitlam certainly wasn't the economic reformer that Bob Hawke was, or for that matter that Paul Keating was, but it's also true that Whitlam, whether he knew it or not at the time, was responsible for one of the most transformative economic decisions in our nation's history. And I'm talking, of course, about his trip to China in 1971 and the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between Australia and the People's Republic of China in 1972, incidentally the year that I was born. It's easy to forget, looking back now through the mist of time, just how contentious and how politically dangerous that first trip was. It could have been political suicide. Remember, we're talking about a time at the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was raging. Whitlam was the first Western leader to have visited what was then a largely unrecognised regime. He went because he saw opportunity for himself, but also for Australia. And as it turns out, he was right. China's now our biggest trading partner, all from a standing start of less than 50 years ago. 1 in $3 that we make from trade, we make from China. And just to put that in perspective, no other advanced economy is as heavily leveraged today to China as we are. China's the biggest trading partner for, I think, about 130 countries around the world. So in that respect, we're not unique. But no other developed country sends a greater percentage of its exports to China than we do. That creates opportunities, but it also creates risks. It means we have the potential to benefit more than most from the rise of China, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we already have. But think about this. We currently invest more in New Zealand than we do in China. In fact, we invest today more in New Zealand than we do in China, Japan, South Korea, in fact, all of Asia combined. According to the most recent ABS data, about 18,000 companies, Australian companies, currently export goods that are worth more than $2,000 to New Zealand, but only 7,000 export the same to China. Another example. Lots of Chinese tourists visit Australia every year. It's currently more than 1 million. But still only 8% of Chinese citizens have a passport. I give you these examples about investment, the number of companies exporting to New Zealand versus China, and the potential growth in tourism, because they show an extraordinary opportunity for Australia, a lot of untapped opportunities. But there are also risks, and we've had a taste of that in the last few months. A few unwise and provocative and frankly stupid remarks from the Prime Minister and other ministers over the last few months have had an impact on wine and beef exports. We've had issues like this before, and invariably we will again. It's almost inevitable. What matters is when they happen, how do you sort them out? I want you to think about this for a minute. Think back to March of this year when President Trump was threatening to put tariffs on Australian steel and aluminium. When that happened, the government pulled out all stops. A month before, the Prime Minister led a delegation of premiers and chief ministers and business leaders to Washington. When Trump threatened to put tariffs on everyone, including us, we were able to then pick up the phone, lobby friends in Congress, in the White House, and in the business community. And we got a good result. We got a great result, and I congratulated the government at the time. Now compare that to what's happening in China at the moment. The chairman of one Australian wine company has tried to get the Prime Minister on the phone a number of times and still can't get him to return the call. Beef companies have also written to the Trade Minister and the Prime Minister about the problems that they're facing and are still waiting for a response. It's very different to the way the government worked with BlueScope when they were threatened with steel tariffs by the US only a couple of months ago. The fact is, we don't have anywhere near the depth or the strength of relationships with China and our Chinese counterparts that we do with the United States. And that, in and of itself, is not a surprise. But given the problems that we have at the moment, and given the likelihood that there will be other problems that we'll need to sort out down the track, it's important that we build and strengthen the key relationships that we're going to need so that when problems do arise, we can sort them out. Now, I'm not saying this is easy. China is very different to the United States. It can be a complex place to navigate, but we have to do this, given how critical the relationship is. We have to make this a priority. As Zhao Enlai said to Whitlam in the Great Hall of the People all those years ago in 1971, all things develop from small beginnings. Later on today, you're going to hear from some of my colleagues, Penny Wong and Chris Bowen, and I'm sure they're going to talk a little bit about our Future Asia plan. Chris launched it back in September of last year, and since then, Penny and myself have both added to it, and there's more to come. But at its core, at the core of what we call Future Asia, is what I've just been talking about, and that's relationships, building closer bonds between people. Let me give you a few examples of the policies we've already announced and how they link back to this theme. We've got an extraordinary asset in Australia, an asset that we currently don't utilise anywhere near as well as we should. More than 4 million Australians can trace their ancestry back to Asia, and we've said that we'll set up an Australian-Asian diaspora program, a bit like the diaspora programs that you can see that have been set up and work well in the United States, to better coordinate and tap into the skills and experience and connections of our Asian diaspora here in Australia and our Australian diaspora in Asia. Language is important too in building relationships. And again, this is an area where we've failed dismally. There are lots of Australians who speak an Asian language, but most either brought it with them or learned it here from their parents, not at school. Think about this. In 2015, there were about 4,000, a bit over 4,000 Australian students studying Mandarin at high school. But 90% of them were from an Asian background. Fixing this, getting more Australian students to study Mandarin at high school is going to take a lot of work. It requires a lot of heavy lifting by state education departments, but it also requires national leadership. Just as depressing is the number of Australian business people who've got any experience living and working and doing business in Asia. Last year, AsiaLink surveyed Australian directors and senior executives of our top 200 listed companies. And what they found was that only 10% of the directors and the senior executives of these companies had a high level of experience doing business in Asia. Now think about that for a second. Only 10% of the directors and senior executives of our top 200 listed companies have got experience doing business in Asia. You know, I think that answers a lot of the questions we have about the reluctance or the reticence of companies to invest in Asia. Why would you risk your shareholders' money? Why would you put your neck on the line yourself if you didn't know what you were getting in for, if you didn't know the market you were seeking to invest in? To help to rectify this, we've said we'll set up a program with the Australian Institute of Company Directors to mentor people that have already got experience working in Asia to get onto these boards. And we've said that if the Chinese government agrees, we also want to set up an internship program for young Australians, young Australian professionals that might have finished a business degree or an economics degree or a finance degree here in Australia or in China, to then do a 6-month internship working for a business in China and get real-life commercial experience, a better understanding of what it's like to work in China. It's not unique. The French have just signed an agreement like this with the Chinese, and I think that we could be the next cab off the rank. And if it works, I think it's the sort of thing we could replicate with other countries. You know, perhaps Indonesia, free trade agreements being discussed with them at the moment. As I said, I think my colleagues Chris and Penny will talk about this a little bit later today, but you can get a sense from what I've already just described of where we're heading. It's all about relationships and about building the sorts of skills that young Australians are going to need to help to build those relationships in the future. What we've announced already, you should assume, is just the start, and hopefully some of the ideas that will percolate out of the discussions here today could help to add to that. Thanks very much.
So, Jason's, we've got time for 5 minutes of questions. Can I just begin with one, if I might? Chair's prerogative. We had a meeting of the Australia-China Business Council, our ACT branch, last night, and we were talking about many of the issues, Jason, that you've been talking about the importance of building relationships and just culture and understanding. And one of the things that's impressed us have been the efforts of certainly the Victorian government, where the Premier there has made it mandatory for every minister to visit China as part of their visits program, because, you know, typically, as you know, ministers, they'll visit the United States, they'll go to Europe, they'll go to London, but in the hierarchy of things, China tends to be right down the bottom. But I just wonder, is that something you've discussed at Shadow Cabinet, and do you think that sort of idea has merit?
Well, a couple of things. It hasn't been lost on anyone that there's only been one Australian minister to visit China this year, or in the space of, I guess, the last 9 or 10 months. And that stands in stark contrast to leaders from other countries around the world. I've made the point in the context of the troubles that we've got at the moment that Australia doesn't need to pander to China. All we need to do is act in a professional way. Think about this for a minute. In terms of building stronger relationships with a country like China, very few countries do it better than Germany. And Germany doesn't pull its punches when it comes to issues where it disagrees with China. There's plenty of them. And yet a couple of weeks ago, Angela Merkel was in Beijing with President Xi, going through tough issues like the Iran nuclear deal. So you can have difficult issues that you need to sort out from time to time, but the key to it is having the relationships you need so you can pick up the phone and sort things out, or get on an aeroplane and sit down and work them out. And that's what I've encouraged the Prime Minister and the government to do here. It's what John Howard did back in 1996 when there were issues associated with Taiwan. And state governments play an important role here too. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people in the room that would vouch for the good work that the Victorian government does. The Victorian government often tells me how good they work in this area.
They have very good foundations.
Yeah, well, and to be had a great premier once upon a time, and do today. When I talk about building, strengthening, thickening relationships, it's not just at a federal level, it's at a state level as well. We can do a lot of good by encouraging states to do that work and help us. It's got to be a collective national effort, and I think states can help in that regard. And one of the things that I suspect we can do better, and I'll be interested to see if I get some nods when I say this, is to improve the collaboration and the coordination between Austrade and between their state government counterparts. Sometimes, and not exclusively China, but other countries can get a little bit confused when trade ministers like Craig Emerson go overseas, and there's the Australian brand, and then there's New South Wales or Victoria, and who is this? Is this Victoria from Australia or Canada? The better we can collaborate and coordinate that effort, both in terms of brand, I know the government's doing some work on that, but more generally in terms of a Team Australia effort, I think will help us in the long term.
Okay, thank you. We're going to have one more very quick question, or else we'll wind it. Yep. Yes, over on the right-hand side. Yep.
Complex question, but how much weight should we put on, it may seem obvious as well, but how much weight would we put on the fact that Australia just has difficulty understanding that business is done differently. It's very easy to do business with a Western culture, but what needs to happen for us to learn that better? Is it just conversation?
Part of that explains why you've got more Australian businesses doing business in New Zealand than in China. There's that the language barrier doesn't exist. The cultural barriers are different. It's an easier place to start. But given the enormous opportunity that exists, not just in China but throughout Asia, I think it's incumbent upon us in this room, not just the politicians but the business community, to think about how we make it easier for Australian businesses to take that first step. I missed the first session here, but things like what Andrew and the team are doing at Australia Post, the sort of things Alibaba is doing as well, helps Australian businesses to take that first step into new markets, into markets like China, without having to sink a lot of money or sink a lot of time, put your toe in the water and see if it works. But ultimately, you're not going to be as successful as you might be unless you do understand that business culture. Hence the point I made earlier about encouraging more Australian young executives to spend time doing an internship in China or other countries in Asia, because nothing beats that experience. I've had a number of people, I'm sure there'll be people like this in this room, who tell me, I've worked for 10 years in Asia, I came back looking for a job, put my CV on the table, and that didn't count for as much as I thought it would. That disappoints me, because I would have thought that type of experience should be invaluable to Australian businesses, big and small.
All right, thank you. I'm very conscious of the time. We're 5 minutes over. So could you join me in thanking Jason and Clare today for that excellent presentation?
Thanks, mate.
Okay, we'll move straight on to our next panel, if we could. So our next panel is on international education, and to moderate this session, can I introduce Misha Schubert. Misha is the Director of Strategic Communications for University Australia, the peak body representing the sector's 39 universities. During her career covering federal politics from the Press Gallery in Canberra, she served as National Political Editor for the Sunday Age, Political Correspondent for The Age, a reporter for The Australian, a regular commentator on ABC TV's Insiders and Sky News Agenda. As I said, she is also a former Director of Communications for the Recognised Movement and is a Director and Vice President of the National Press Club of Australia, and someone I think I first met here in Canberra way back at the Constitutional Convention in 1998, I think, which sounds like it's only 20 years ago.
But we're both still so young, John.
20 years ago. So please welcome Misha Schubert and the panel.
Well, thank you so much, John Brumby, as chair of this august organisation, and thank you to you all for the opportunity to talk about international education today. It's my great pleasure to be in the chair today to facilitate this panel session on international education, and I'm representing our Chief Executive, Katrina Jackson, who isn't able to be here today but sends her warm wishes to you all for a terrific day of networking and discussions. I also want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to your elders, past and present, because you are the safekeepers of memory and law and language and knowledge and culture in this land. And it's that foundation which is the basis of our shared identity as Australians in the world, and a unique identity. Thank you so much to the Australia Business China Council, especially to you, John, as Chair, and to Chief Executive Helen Sorzak for the opportunity to discuss these issues in today's event. It's a terrific lineup you've gathered. The Honourable Phil Honeywood, who is here, is obviously known to many in this room, not only as the Chief Executive Officer of the International Education Association of Australia, but also from his time as a Victorian Member of Parliament and as a Minister for Tertiary Education in Victoria, and has served on many important bilateral bodies representing Australia's education interests in the world. Laurie Pearcey is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at UNSW Sydney, and in that capacity he leads UNSW's international engagement work, including its crucial engagements throughout China. He's also previously led the China and India priority country strategies in his work at UNSW, and he'll be known to you as, of course, in his previous guise with the Australia-China Business Council. Professor Duncan Bentley is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at Swinburne University of Technology. He's also deeply engaged in building Australian international education education in the world, and looking at learning transformation strategies here in Australia as well, which may have resonance and interest to those of you who are engaged in education-aligned business opportunities in China and in the region. And Sunny Yang is the Associate Vice President of Student Recruitment and Admissions at Monash University. She's got a terrifically long career and lots of experience in trade, working back for the South Australian Government for a long time, but has also been a really engaged senior executive throughout the region, building Australia's success as an international education powerhouse. So we're going to start with some discussion between the panel and then invite you to play a role in the conversation as well. I wondered, Phil, if we start with you, at IEAA you represent a really wide range of Australian education providers right across the spectrum. Can you start perhaps by talking about the value of those engagements, what that brings, and particularly mindful of what Jason Clare had to say about the value of relationships and skills and culture and understanding? What role does education play in all of those things?
Sure. Well, look, data is really important to international education, just as people-to-people contacts are. And just to give people here a context of how enormous international education now is for Australia, America has just gone past its 1 millionth international fee-paying student. They have a population of 340 million people. Australia, 24 million people. We've got 650,000 tuition fee-paying international enrolments. So we've heard about punching above our weight. Australia is a massive study destination country in the world. Having said that, Chinese students account for around 30 to 34% of total student numbers across our high schools, our English language colleges, our TAFE and our higher education. But they also account for that same percentage in America, in the UK, in New Zealand. So it's not as though Australia is totally reliant on one country. We are very much diversifying into other markets, but the Chinese market is very much front and centre with everything we do. And then, of course, there's both a dividend and a price to pay for these involvements with other student destination or student source countries. The dividend is clearly that we gain from our geopolitical advantage in the Asian corner of the world. It means that Chinese parents can contact their child in the same time zone often. They can ensure that they can come out here as tourists much more easily than going to many other countries. And it means that people-to-people relationships are incredibly strong. The price we pay, however, is that we are, in a geopolitical sense, we are front and centre in the Indo-Pacific. We, of course, going back to Kevin Rudd saluting George W. Bush not so many years ago, we agreed to be the Deputy Sheriff of the United States at that point for looking after the Pacific. So when we make comparisons with Germany, when we make comparisons with Britain and Donald Trump in USA, we argue in international education that Donald Trump and Theresa May are our greatest assets because they've done a lot to stop international students from being encouraged to study there. But equally, Australia is a totally different geopolitical context to the remoteness, geographically, etc., of other study destination countries that we compete with, such as the UK, such as USA. So the people-to-people contacts are incredible, Misha. We've got some fantastic leading researchers now at our Australian universities who came out here as original Colombo Plan students, as original Chinese fee-paying students. At RMIT, for example, we've got Professor Minggu, who's a world leader in photovoltaics, educated at UNSW, Laurie's University as an undergraduate. So the people-to-people contacts are wonderful, and crucially, I should point out that it's not just one-way traffic. This year, there will be over 2,000 young Australian undergraduates going to study in China as part of Julie Bishop's $100 million New Colombo Plan scholarship program. Altogether, 5,000 to date Chinese or undergraduates from Australian universities have gone to China. And importantly, they're not just going there for short-term mobility. Many of them are going for a semester, 2 semesters, and really embedding themselves in the Chinese education system. So we've got a lot of young Australians now who are voting with their feet and choosing China. It's the number 2 study destination country for young Australians after Indonesia, and it's great that those people-to-people contacts are happening in a two-way exchange.
And comes with it a lifetime of kind of return benefit to both nations then. They're terrific points, Phil. Sunny, I wondered if that's a natural opportunity to draw you in here. You've got a very strong track record in market development, both in education but also in the wider trade relationship. What kind of long-range thinking do you think Australia and Australian education providers and education-aligned businesses should be applying to market development when it comes to the China engagement for their businesses?
Sure, Misha. Actually, the last digital panel, the discussion there actually is very relevant to our sector as well. Our market is increasingly in tier 2, 3, 4 cities in China. Our customers seek information from multiple channels. They want it quick. They want it in their own time, in their language, on their gadget. So it really put a lot of challenges to our traditional marketing approaches and channel strategy. So we have to have a very sophisticated and multi-layered, multi-channel strategy in place, and we do have to regularly review and adjust as we move along. Given the audience here today, and people from all states and different sectors, I do want to mention one major point I have is for the whole of Australia, there is an absolute need for us to engage and build our brand with the school sector in China. So according to an IIE report, the number of international secondary students in the US more than tripled between 2004 and 2016. So not surprisingly, China has been the important driver of secondary enrollment growth in the US over the past decade. China alone accounts for nearly 60% of total enrollment of diploma-seeking secondary students of F1 visas in the US. And in 2016, this number is well over 33,000 students. What does that mean? Is there is a large cohort of students gone from us. Once in the US, the chance of them then pursuing a higher education study in another country is almost zero. So another significant cohort of school students who want to study overseas one day, spread in a growing number of international schools or international classes at local Chinese schools nowadays in China. Dominate in these schools are curriculums that are internationally recognized, for instance, A-level, which the market generally associate with UK. This is about half of those in China. The other half are predominantly the US-bound advanced placement, and in some smaller numbers, international baccalaureate IB. We have a few ways, say, schools in China, and increasingly we're seeing a few more VCE schools in China, but in absolute numbers, this is very small. Most of the students in these schools would consider either US or UK, depending on what curriculum they offer. Very few students come to Australia. This is a major market Australia is missing out on, as these students tend to be high quality and they actually set their mind on studying overseas day one. I do want to emphasize the importance of engaging with this cohort because there is a rapid growth of these international schools in China since 2010 probably. According to a Chinese agency, Xinxue, they calculated there are about 739 international schools by mid-2016. Shanghai alone has more than 140 of these schools. The volume of students in these schools is huge. So we cannot ignore their growth because they have effectively locked students away in a large US or UK-bound pathway. So if we don't engage, our market at the upstream will be squeezed out gradually. So the point and main message I want to have is our universities and our school sectors and our government needs to really work together. We need to work together to engage and reach into the school sector in China, and we need to do this a lot better if we want to ensure the future flow of students to Australian programs. To finish, I just want to say wealth and aspiration really have driven the exponential growth of demand from China on international education. But we must remember their choices are also more than ever. The top receiving destinations have largely remained the same: US, UK, Canada, Australia. And increasingly China itself, with the mushroom of better quality local, foreign and joint programs on offer in country. The popularity of these destinations can and often do shift. Ultimately, the customers look for the brands they want, the value, the outcomes and experience. We have to work hard at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny. That's some terrific points. And I'm conscious that we've got in the audience people from EduTech and other providers who are working at that school level. So it seems like there's a natural opportunity here today to continue that conversation as it unfolds. Laurie, that seems like a really natural segue from the education side of what universities do in particular into the broader engagement that we have around research and innovation and the significant investment being made by China in those fields. What are the sorts of opportunities that you see for Australian businesses and education providers and startups in that innovation agenda in China?
Sure, thank you, and good morning, colleagues. It's wonderful to be back here at the ACBC Canberra Networking Day. I want to talk a little bit about China's rise as an innovation superpower and what this means for Australia, and I think it's important to put some of this in context. In your programs this morning, you will note that in fact, it was the forward preceding the last session that the OECD forecasts that by 2019, China will be the world's largest investor in research and development. And what we're seeing is that R&D spending is growing by an average of 18% year on year, and that was from the start of the current decade. So China is investing real political and financial capital in the power of R&D and what it means for its economy. And also this is true in higher education too. We hear lots of media commentary about China's defence spending, which the latest defence budget sits at $224 billion. It's worth noting that China's total higher education budget sits at $222 billion, so just $2 billion less than China's total investment in defence. China really gets the importance of investment in both research and higher education to its economic productivity. And rising university graduation and higher education participation has been key to what the ambassador referred to this morning as China's poverty reduction agenda. I'm amazed that in 2017, China graduated 8 million people from university. I learnt that speaking at a forum in Hong Kong, and it was worth reflecting 20 years after Hong Kong was returned to Chinese sovereignty. That 8 million number is 10 times higher than what it was when Hong Kong returned to PRC rule as a special administrative region. And this is really extraordinary because you have a government that is continuing to invest real political and financial capital in the power of education. And the opportunities for Australia in this space, I think, are significant, and they have been for a long time. Universities like mine, and indeed another institution in Sydney known as the University of Sydney, a few of you might have heard of it, we've been welcoming Chinese international students for 40 years. And people talk a lot about the importance of international education for the Chinese middle class, but it's also worth reflecting that since the time of Confucius, some 2,000 years ago, China has invested real capital and real value in the power of education. And for a country like Australia, where we are blessed in that we have roughly 10 universities in the world top 200, as well as an endowment of great Chinese Australians, over 40 years of diplomatic relations and time zone and all of those things which you all know so well, means that we have a rich history and solid foundations to grow even further. And I think that as Phil alluded to, the opportunities that we see through initiatives like the New Colombo Plan, but also how can Australian startups that are cultivated through university entrepreneurship programs and elsewhere in the wider economy, how can Australian startups and dynamic hungry Australian businesses access and indeed capitalise on the phenomenal investment that we're seeing in R&D and innovation. And one of the reasons why I left the ACBC and chose to join education was because I was amazed that even 5-6 years ago that there were companies like Huawei, and it's great that we've got Huawei in the room today, that from the very beginning have consistently invested more than 5%, I think, is the average of their annual revenue in R&D. These are companies that get this. They understand it for their competitiveness, and there's a lot spoken about in terms of IP protection, and sure, there are risks involved in any international engagement, but also the one reflection that I would make, and I'll conclude with this, is that as China's own quantum of investment in R&D increases dramatically and increases consistently, just in the same way as any other country that ascends the innovation ladder, as they focus on that indigenous innovation, then the incentives, and we're seeing this already in China, the incentives to protect IP, the incentives to internationalise will grow exponentially. And I think that this is an extraordinary opportunity for Australia, and what a great forum to discuss this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurie, and not least for the important reminder about the importance of long-term sustained investment in higher education and research by national governments. It's also a little known fact, I think, that Australian universities have something more than 100 startup hubs, incubators, entrepreneurship facilities, some of which are fostering student talent and teaching them those skills about founding startups, including those that are engaged in the region and in China, but also which are opportunities for others to come in and work with university facilities around the country. Duncan, collaborations are another really important part of this bilateral relationship, and that's one of your areas of expertise, those sort of collaborations with research institutes, but also on the need that both of our economies will face in the future to not just train people at the earliest part of their working lives, but to reskill and upskill them at later points in their working career trajectory. What opportunities do you see for those collaborations into the next part of our shared future together?
Thanks, Misha. I might just start by saying that, surprisingly, Australian higher education doesn't invest a lot into New Zealand. Going on the earlier talk, we focus on Asia. And as all of you in the room will be familiar with, I'm an exchange and study abroad, which has already been mentioned, raises things like global awareness, global citizenship and cross-cultural understanding. The New Colombo Plan, the Chinese government scholarships. For 40 years or so, as Laurie has said, we have been seeing the exchange of students both ways. And many of you in the room will be the product of those relationships and those experiences. There are tens of thousands of Australian and Chinese businesses which are riding off the back of those relationships and those trusted engagements which were built over the last 4 decades. And we've got to remember that it is, as the ambassador said, all about relationships and trust. If you think of it, our parents all those years ago entrusted their children to the other country just in the same way as we are entrusting our children to each other's countries today. And you don't send your children somewhere where you don't want them to go. It's a place of trust, a place of relationships. And what we've got to look at is how we can build on that even further. One of the things that we're both facing as nations is employer dissatisfaction with graduates. There was a survey out recently, and you'll have seen in the press that there were concerns that over 25% of Australian graduates may not have sufficient skills from the perspective of employers to be able to tackle the workforce of the future. And in China, the employers are saying, a higher number of employers are saying similar things. And so what are we doing about it as higher education and as educational institutions right through to vocational education and schools? Well, we're integrating into the curriculum internships and work projects for students while they're studying, working with future employers, working with businesses, leveraging off the fact that we have so many Australian and Chinese graduates who have already interconnected and who are willing in their businesses to take on those short-term interns. It's interesting that the demand is far more significant in China for both Australian and Chinese interns from Australian universities than it is by Australian businesses. And it's right across all the different sectors. For example, we're seeing huge emerging opportunities in healthcare collaboration, services and business opportunities, public health delivery, digital health into remote areas. I mean, we're talking about, well, we might go into Beijing or Shanghai or some of the tier 1, 2 or 3 cities. We're talking about universities working with businesses right into the most remote and regional areas. Australian businesses should piggyback on the back of that because the service demands in places like Inner Mongolia and the other remote and regional areas is significant. Students from Australia and China are able to combine their expertise to train in, say, new techniques and treatments in hospitals which are turning over 10,000 patients a day. Operations on the scale that our surgeons wouldn't see in 10 years are being done in a few weeks. And that's the sort of capability for us to be able to leverage off the research and development which is taking place in China into new techniques, new treatments, new ways of doing things which Australia can take advantage of because of our trusted relationships. Our students are in there helping with transport mapping for logistics and supply chain in some of the world's busiest ports. They're bringing back that learning and that capability to be deployed in Australia. And our expertise is being deployed in China as well, and it's building those relationships. The industry research, where we're establishing research institutes right across China, means that we're collaborating with universities, but also industry precincts, building those industry connections. And for Australian businesses, one of the things you could look at is where are the universities establishing those research precincts so that you can connect with some early stage projects for your business expansion with trusted partners of Chinese and Australian universities. They've got the infrastructure, they've got the scale, they've got the connections that you can feed off the back of. Whether it's in things like water treatment, smart cities to improve public transport, or modernisation and rejuvenation of regional industries, which we're really good at in Australia. One of our student projects, which was connected with some industry projects recently, was to look at the cashmere wool industry in Inner Mongolia, building off the expertise from Australia, but bringing that learning back to Australia. The other element which Misha mentioned, which is so important, is the fact that you'll be aware in Australia that we've been focused very strongly over the last few years about reskilling and upskilling workforces in dying industries or industries which are going through major transformation. That digital transformation of industry is taking place apace here. It's also taking place at pace and scale in China. And the opportunities for universities and businesses here to collaborate on that reskilling and upskilling of workforces in specific sectors is significant. Because if you think of it, the academic and the industry expertise combined to be able to be deployed to improve and significantly increase the skills of those who are transforming sectors in China. If you can get in with collaborative partners early on in the piece, build the trust, build the relationships, help them with that transformation, then you're immediately establishing the collaboration you need, the markets potentially that you need, but it'll also give you avenues to bring skilled expertise back to Australia to be able to maintain that two-way scaling up of our businesses, whether it's vocational education and modern apprenticeships for the 21st century, whether it's upskilling managers, or whether it's training in digital technologies and processes. I think it's an incredible fact, as Laurie said, that the Chinese research and development is so huge. if you look at it, we simply are too small in Australia to have more than a handful of major investors in research and development at world scale. We should be taking advantage of that from Australia, our partnerships built over four decades, to be able to expand our business connections and go well beyond the idea that we just tie into the, I suppose, shopfront cities which you normally come across. And as I look around the room, I can see young people who are already coming out of things like the exchange and study abroad and internship processes who have established businesses. We should be connecting far more with the younger businesses who already are very conversant across the countries.
Some terrific insights there. Thank you, Duncan. Maybe before we go to questions from the floor, a question to the whole panel. What further opportunities do each of you see perhaps for, cognizant of some of those links and natural connection points that each of you have identified, what further opportunities can Australia and China leverage out of that pipeline of skilled graduates who understand each other's cultures and have that level of fluency and cultural literacy in both directions?
I think one thing is curriculum design. Unfortunately, it's been too easy for many Australian education institutions just to rely on commerce and business degrees. And we're finding now that, for example, my alma mater, ANU, are now deliberately putting together a music degree with an engineering degree under their modern degree program, because we're finding that a lot of Chinese students are excellent musicians. You know, the Tiger Mums have had them in the music practice rooms from the time they've been very young, and they want to carry on, for example, with their music talent, rather than just be put into I guess, square peg in a round hole necessarily with a particular degree that somebody else wants them to do. So I think curriculum design is going to be really important in terms of matching to the points that have been made this morning about those post-1990 born young people who really want to add value to some of their education experience. Equally, there's some wonderful examples of Australian high schools, for example. Derek Scott's in the room, the principal of Hailbury, the largest private school in Australia. Derek, I think you've currently got 3 campuses in China. You're looking to scale up, you told me today, to 5 or 6. And that's providing an Australian curriculum with Chinese values and ensuring a pipeline of potential students who may choose to come to Australia subsequently, but may go to another country as well. So Australia's not just trying to direct traffic only to Australia. We're educating young Chinese in China and providing them with the global citizenship attributes that Duncan mentioned.
I'd echo what Phil said in terms of curriculum design and building degrees that foster that inter and multidisciplinary skill set that we know employers are pursuing. But also, I think there's a lot that we can learn from not just China, but across the wider emerging Asian region in terms of the extraordinary innovation ecosystem that we see unfolding on our doorstep, and it's become something that we're really trying to embed in all of our graduates, be they domestic or international students, and that's that. These days, don't find a job, create one. And we already have Australia's largest student startup program. Many of our Australian universities are actively involved in this area, but also how do we ensure that startup experience or that introduction to innovation and entrepreneurship is multinational? And so whether it's working with partners in China, partners elsewhere in the region on innovation and entrepreneurship schemes at scale, it's also worth noting that China today has, $34 billion of venture capital investment, I think off a baseline of around $3 billion more than a decade ago, which accounts for, 27% of the global total. And so we know that rather than, Silicon Valley, and of course it's an important innovation hub, but how do we connect our students, but also our Australian students, and also the tens of thousands or indeed hundreds of thousands of international students that come to our shores with these opportunities, because the future of work is, it's a bit of a cliche that's bandied around a lot at the moment, the future of work is rapidly changing, and the feedback that we get from employers is that not every student that they recruit into their graduate program is necessarily going to go on and become a Mark Zuckerberg, but the idea that a student that they recruit understands innovation, understands disruption, it will help prepare companies for the disruptive future that we know will unleash itself upon companies all around the world. So really employing graduates that get this mindset, but doing so at scale with quality, and I think across borders is what's going to define the future competitiveness of our universities and our economy.
I might just add very, very quickly, if you know of businesses which are wanting to expand further into China, as Laurie said, almost every university in Australia has an innovation precinct. And we've got landing pads with my university, and we're a small university in Singapore, San Francisco, and Shanghai. Find yourself a university, go into the innovation and accelerator precinct and see how you can use the student and staff connections which are already there to see whether you can't springboard more easily into what can be a very daunting market.
Well, actually, all three of them, I totally agree. So I'm not going to repeat what they've already said. The one thing I want to mention is the speed of development, the adoption of technology, and the sheer innovation in China now is truly amazing. So we can't really assume that what we offer is always better. And that's what my observation is. There's a lot to learn from each other. And in many ways that rather than competing head on, there's a lot of room for us to partner and really, learn from each other. Thank you.
Terrific point. We've got 5 minutes left for questions. Can I see? I've got a hand up just over here.
Hello, my name is Carl Williams. I'm a co-director with Victoria earlier with Edutech schools in China. We have schools in China that offer Chinese students the ability to qualify for their Australian high school certificate, which gives them direct entry to universities in Australia. My question to the panel is, just following on from Sunny, is how do the universities propose to work more closely with the high school sector to overcome the issue that Sunny brought up earlier?
Thank you for the question. I do think it's a multi-layered engagement. The reason why I mentioned curriculum is it is important, and I, for one, is a big fan of supporting our VCE to go into China and see it expanding, not just in China, but broadly in other Asian countries as well. And VCE is doing great in China, and the other states have their programs in the country as well. So the curriculum is one side. The other side, of course, is increasingly in even teachers. And if you look at the school principals, the head teachers, the career counsellors, a lot of them are actually Americans and British. We'd like to see more of those, because their influence on student and the destination cannot be underestimated. There are many ways of engagement, but one thing I do find, because we visit a lot of schools, and often you very regularly hear our students aspire to go to the US and UK, the top, Ivy League, G5. Australia, yes, some of them may, but I really feel that our brand is not strong enough. The recognition is not there. This is a collective piece of work. It's not just one institution. So we need to regularly get in there, and we're not doing enough.
Just on that, Australia, not for the first time because of our vexed federal system, suffers from having 6 or 7 different school certificates that we take offshore when we promote school level education. New Zealand, by comparison, who proportionally have more fee-paying international students than Australia does to their population, 20% of the international students in New Zealand are studying at New Zealand high schools. Here in Australia, it's only 3%. It's largely because We don't go offshore with one Australian certificate of education. Different states are competing against one another, and it doesn't send the right message. So if there's one thing we could do in the school sector to have one combined certificate, then that would ensure those mixed messages and that competition between different state governments ensures that Team Australia can go forward and do well.
One of the critical things is not just to have one vehicle by which you gain entry to an institution. That goes against access and accessibility, both domestically and internationally, and broadening the means of access through portfolios and other forms of assessment so that you can look at the whole student and a whole portfolio of skills, knowledge and attributes is going to be critical both for international as well as domestic students.
Just to add, I think let 100 flowers bloom. Australian universities have been very good at trailblazing internationally. And our university, we're proud to recognise a whole raft of qualifications from international schools in China and Australian high school qualifications, and we're agnostic in terms of the state qualification in which they come from, but also a reflection that I would make, and that's that the pathways market, so the foundation studies and the diploma programs, which have been the bread and butter of many Australian universities in their undergraduate commencements for many years, we do see that shifting because, as Sunny pointed out in her remarks, over the last few years there has been a proliferation in the number of onshore international high school qualifications taught in China, and so it's incumbent on all of us to work more closely with schools like yours, Carl, and indeed others from across Australia and around the world, because we do see that mix shifting.
We are hard up against the clock, but does anyone else among the members have a burning question? Just over here.
Felice Chen, and I represent IMI Study based in Sydney. So we are an online platform to help Australian universities to find better quality international students and to find international students, to help international students to find best matches courses in Australian. Australian does very well in terms of international student size. My question to the panelists, especially to Laurie and Sunny, is how, besides the good size, what else can we do to, can we also strive to recruit better quality students from China or other target markets, and how can we do that? Especially the international students, the potential international students are 1990 born young group of people, and their customer behavior has changed a lot. How can we compete? How can top Australian universities compete with top UK and US universities? Thank you.
Who wants to make a on that?
I might just mention one of the great reforms in Australia in recent years has been QUILT, the Quality Indicators of Learning and Teaching. And whereas before, with the greatest respect to Monash and UNSW, that are a group of 8 universities, whereas up until recently, international students often go for the university's ranking, and the various ranking, there's so many ranking devices now that every university qualifies to be a top university. The QUILT program allows, it's an Australian government auspiced website, any student, domestic or international, can go onto it, and they can look at the employer satisfaction rate and the graduate outcomes based on individual courses. So we're finding that student behaviour is now changing largely because they can now, in a fairly objective manner, go onto the Quality Indicators of Learning and Teaching website and see that, hey, Swinburne might be fantastic and have the best outcomes in a particular course that they're interested in. And these type of important indicators, I think, are gradually changing student behaviour. Of course, they'll still go to Group of 8 because of the various wonderful things that Laurie and Sunny's universities do, but equally, students been far more, as we heard earlier today, post-1990, been far more motivated by individual motivations and aspirations, are now looking at courses over necessarily country of destination, over necessarily institution.
Just very briefly, picking up on that question, I think it's a really good one, and dovetailing on Phil's comments. In addition to QUILT, there's also the International Student Barometer, which is completed by I think over 160 universities around the world, including Australia's major competitors for international students. The average student satisfaction rates across the International Student Barometer, these are international students voting for institutions. The average satisfaction rates, I think, are around 80-odd%, and the average for Australia is in the early 90s, I believe. And so again, we've heard this a lot today. Australia punches well above its weight when it comes to strong performance, with international students speaking in glowing terms about their experiences here. But also what we're seeing is that as tertiary enrolment rates grow across China and elsewhere in Asia, we're seeing the quality of students coming out of the school system and indeed into universities growing quite significantly. And so the quality that universities can recruit from, I think, is growing dramatically, and that's a great thing for our institutions.
I get a sense that there is lots more appetite and interest, but we are very hard up against the clock. So perhaps can I suggest, if members of the room wanted to continue their conversations with some of the panel, we'd love that opportunity to do that in the next break. But can I just, on behalf of the room, please thank each of our panellists for their excellent insights into education and research. Thank you. Back over to you.
Well, thank you, Misha, and to all of the panel. And that was a great session. I think what really jumped out for me, those numbers on secondary education. We do so well in tertiary education, but in secondary education, we are well below the US and the UK. So it's now my great privilege to introduce our next keynote speaker, the Honourable Penny Wong. So Penny is the Shadow Minister, as you know, for Foreign Affairs and a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. She was elected to the Senate in 2001. Following the election of the Labor government in 2007, Penny was appointed the Minister for Climate Change and Water and later served as Minister for Finance and Deregulation. In 2013, she was appointed Leader of the Government in the Senate, and after the change of government, she was appointed Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. Penny Wong has been a very regular contributor to our ACBC dialogues and discussion and debate. We thank her for that. She is a very senior politician with immense experience in government and in opposition, and so we welcome you today, Penny Wong.
Immense experience makes me sound old, doesn't it? It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you at this networking event, and I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and paying my respect to any elders past and present. I understand the Ambassador Chung has left, but in his absence, acknowledge him. Acknowledge you, John, who's I think CV needs no reiteration, and thank you for your contribution to the Australia-China relationship. Also acknowledge Craig Emerson, my former ministerial colleague. To all of you, business leaders, community leaders, representatives, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and with you. I didn't mind you continuing with questions because I figured then I'd get fewer questions. Then the gentleman next to me said, "Oh, you love questions." Anyway, look, I wanted to talk to you first about the relationship with China. And then I am happy to take some questions at John's request. Obviously, the Australia-China Business Council is an organisation with longevity. I think you've existed for almost as long as we've had diplomatic relations with China. You're one of our, if not the oldest non-government institutional link with China. You play a key role in the bilateral relationship between our two countries. And I would say to you that role is perhaps even more important now as the bilateral relationship between Australia and China weathers an unsettled period. You'd all be aware of reported tensions that have marked the relationship over recent months. That's led to a few things. In part, amongst other things, to business here in Australia shouldering the burden of slowdowns and administrative hold-ups. It's also led to intimations from China's representative here in Australia about the implications for our economic ties and some fairly direct recent remarks by Foreign Minister Wang. Instances of ill-advised and unnecessarily inflammatory statements from senior members of the government, including bridges to nowhere and the former Deputy Prime Minister's statement, China is a greater threat than terrorism, have been unhelpful. Further, I'd say to you is they've distracted from some of the more complex issues that do arise in our relationship with China, issues and challenges that need to be articulated clearly and purposefully to the Australian people and to China, and not dealt with glibly nor thoughtlessly. The China relationship is both a complex and crucial one. Politically and culturally, we are different countries, and in such complex relationships, differences of approach, objective and opinion will inevitably arise. These differences have become more apparent as China has become more confident in asserting its interests under President Xi. Australia is entitled to assert our national interests, just as China asserts what it sees as its interests. But I believe it is possible for us to assert our interests and safeguard our sovereignty without being offensive nor inflammatory. A more sophisticated approach based on both respect and a firm articulation of our convictions will do more to ensure our national interests are maintained than will disjointed megaphone diplomacy. Similarly, it is also incumbent upon political, business and industry leaders to ensure they handle such debates with a degree of sensitivity and sophistication. In my first speech to Parliament, which was some time ago, I remarked that Australia's diversity can be an aspect of our shared identity. I said it can also be the fault line around which our community fractures. So we must always guard against racial fault lines from our past being permitted to resonate today. As others have noted, the government has fallen short in its management of this key bilateral relationship. A more considered, disciplined and consistent approach is required. It is not in our interests for ties to be strained, nor is it in China's. So what the relationship does need is stability based on mutual understanding. Now, if Labor has the opportunity to form government following the next election, we do understand some of these pressures will persist. We understand that at times our interests will differ, and we understand that challenges in the relationship may intensify. But what government can and should avoid is making things harder than they need to be. So I'd briefly like to outline to you some of the key operating principles that a Shorten Labor government would apply to our management of this critical relationship. First, our starting point is a clear understanding and articulation of our national interests. It is better to start with a clear sense of purpose than a set of problems. And the national interests, as I previously identified, are the security of the nation and its people, the prosperity of the nation and its people, the stability of our region, and constructive internationalism. And our national interests are firmly grounded by our values, which are given expression in the term rule of law. Underpinning this, of course, is the fact that all human beings have worth and dignity by virtue of their shared humanity. Our second operating principle is that we accept we live in a disrupted world. To construct the world we wish to live in, we begin with the world as it is, with its fracture lines, its pressures, the persistent challenge to democracy, and the resurgence of nationalism and populism. Our third operating principle is we accept China as it is, not as others might perceive China to be, or as China itself might represent itself. It is a fact that China is Asia's leading economic power. It is the engine room of the Asian economy, and Asia is collectively the world's biggest economic region. I said earlier, Australia and China are very distinct kinds of countries. We are culturally and politically and socially quite different. Different histories, different origins, different values. Difference is a matter of fact, and differences need to be managed. The important objective is to prevent differences from becoming disagreements as far as possible. And when disagreements do occur, they should be managed with intelligence and with tact. Fourth, we need to acknowledge just how important and how beneficial China's emergence as a major economic power has been. How important and beneficial it has been to Australia, to the world, and to humanity. At the same time, we need to accord China the priority it deserves as our major economic partner. Our economic partnership has grown enormously since we had established diplomatic relations in 1972. And as you know, China's growth has lifted hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty. The world is better for that. China has also contributed to over a quarter of a century of economic growth in this country, and that has been to the benefit of Australia and China. This mutual economic benefit is not just a feature of the past, it will proceed into the future as a consequence of China's growth. In 2016, China's GDP, measured by purchasing power parity, was around $21.4 trillion. By 2030, it is projected to reach $42.4 trillion, roughly twice the size of the US and 25 times bigger than Australia. To the extent possible, Labor will work towards ensuring our political relationship works on the same basis as our economic relationship, respect and trust based on dialogue and understanding. But of course, as business people know, respect and trust don't just happen. They have to be built, they have to be maintained, and that is what we intend to do. Our fifth operating principle is we intend to pursue a coordinated and integrated approach to the many strands of our relationship with China. I am concerned, for instance, that we appear to have a number of silos that don't communicate nearly well enough. I'm also concerned as to whether or not coordination across government is sufficiently fit for purpose. DFAT should be at the centre of this coordination, the lead department for managing the relationship and for managing a whole-of-government China strategy. It was promising to hear in Senate estimates a couple of weeks ago that DFAT is expanding and strengthening its China team. This, of course, goes beyond increasing personnel numbers or strengthening language skills and our understanding of China's political, social and cultural dynamics. DFAT will need to draw on the analytical strengths of ONA and other agencies if we are to acquire a greater understanding of China's economic dynamics and its strategic aspirations and the way these link together to expand its geo-economic power. DFAT should also play an important role in ensuring all parts of government have the same understandings and are working towards the same goals. The work done by all departments needs to be integrated and mutually reinforcing, and it ought not be and should not be at cross purposes. In the public discussion too, key stakeholders appear to be talking past each other. Government and business need to engage frequently to better understand the full spectrum of Australian interests when it comes to China. And our sixth operating principle is to work constructively with China and others in a regional framework. In a speech I gave to Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in January, I spoke of the important place that ASEAN occupies as a central regional institution. ASEAN and its institutions and the way it manages them does offer countries such as Australia and China an important mechanism for enhancing regional stability and prosperity. We can and should work with ASEAN nations to help and build the kind of region we want. And what is the sort of region we want? We want a region where the system of rules and institutions are the basis for collective action. We want a region where those seeking to shape and make the rules do so through negotiation, not imposing their will. We want a region where differences and disputes are resolved through internationally agreed frameworks. We want a region where economic prosperity is based on a free and open trading system and investment transparency. We want a region where outcomes are not determined only by power, and as President Macron put it succinctly during his recent visit, no one wants a region that is characterised by hegemony. Given the historical significance of the events which occurred in Singapore last week, it is also important that we recognise our region does need the ongoing commitment of the US. As the world's only global power, the US has a stabilising role to play in Asia. And the Secretary of DFAT drew our attention to this in Senate estimates a fortnight ago, when she said that our interests is served by a multipolar region, a region where the United States remains deeply and constructively engaged. It is also in the context of the region that we consider China's Belt and Road Initiative. China also already operates a broad network of bilateral relationships in Asia, but the strategic significance of the BRI extends well beyond bilateral interests as it builds a chain of economic and political linkages throughout the region. There is, no doubt, a massive infrastructure deficit in the region. The ADB estimates some $26 trillion in infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is needed between 2016 and 2030. BRI can contribute substantially to addressing this need. But to maximise the benefit and to ensure the sustainability of these investments, projects should be transparent, conform to environmental and social safeguards, and not place unsustainable debt burdens on regional countries. It's against this background that Labor has indicated its willingness to examine BRI projects on a case-by-case basis. Some projects will play to our strengths, others won't. Some will align with our interests and others won't. Some projects will fit with our economic or development assistance plans and others won't. But those that do should be seen as opportunities for the kinds of collaborative partnerships needed if the region is to deliver on its full economic potential. And there will also be opportunities to assist and work with regional countries in their management and implementation of BRI. This is where an association such as the Australia-China Business Council can play such an important role. And I also want to make a point about foreign investment. It is entirely legitimate for Australia to set the parameters for foreign investment we believe are consistent with our national interest. For this reason, Labor supported the security of critical infrastructure legislation that addresses national security risks. It's also for this reason Labor continues to give bipartisan support to Australia's current Foreign Investment Review Board processes. But it is not sensible to reflexively oppose all foreign investment. Australia has always built our economy with investment funded by both domestic and overseas capital. We are a capital-hungry economy that has relied on foreign investment to create Australian jobs and local business opportunities and to boost Australian economic growth. In government, Labor also fully intends to extend and strengthen the 1.5-track dialogues between China and Australia. In our view, the broader and deeper the contacts between Australia and Chinese enterprises and people are, the more robust the bilateral relationship becomes and the more consolidated the outcomes will be. So in short, what do I think the relationship with China needs? It needs consistency. It needs clarity about where our interests converge and where they differ. It needs a sophisticated approach to managing difference, and it needs us to work together where we can. Where our interests do not align, we should be firm in expressing that, preferably not through the media, but through direct and honest discussion between our governments. And as I have previously emphasised, we should always approach China with respect, not fear. And it is for governments to set the pace here. It's not good enough simply sit around waiting for things to improve. Rather, it's the government's job to make things improve. And that's precisely what Labor intends to do. My colleagues, Chris Bowen, who I think you'll hear from later today, Jason Clare, who I think you've spoken to, and Richard Miles, together with me, have advanced our future Asia policy, aimed at revitalising our engagement with Asia in general. And to get it right with Asia, we have to get it right with China. And the reason for this is, I think, obvious. For all their own growth and prosperity, all the economies of Asia in large part rely on China's enormous energy as a consumer and producer. China's economic success is critical to Asia's success as it is critical to our own. And Labor accepts that as a fact, just as we accept that our long-term relationship needs to focus on maintaining mutual benefit. And there is mutual benefit, as you know. We benefit from the fact that almost 200,000 Chinese students buy our educational services, and China benefits from the transfer of the skills that those students acquire, although I did note the comment in the previous panel that we ought not overestimate what we are actually providing compared to what is starting to be provided in China. Australia benefits from the fact that about 1.4 million Chinese nationals visit our country each year and spend more than most other visitors. And I hope our Chinese visitors benefit from experiencing a welcoming, interesting, safe and beautiful country. Mutuality is key. And just as Whitlam back in 1972, before I arrived in this country, just as he could identify mutual benefit at a time when fear-mongering about China was the leitmotif of the McMahon government, so Labor can identify mutual benefit at a time when clumsiness and inconsistency have been the leitmotifs of the Turnbull government. Whitlam's insight, vision and confidence provided the first critical step that set Australia on the path to a relationship that has been of great benefit and continues to be of great benefit to us. Our collective task, and one to which Labor is committed, is to ensure that that mutual benefit is continued. And all of this requires shared understanding, to which the Australia-China Business Council contributes substantially. As the Governor of the Reserve Bank said recently, we all have a strong interest in understanding China, and what is more, as Philip Lowe said, we all have a role in helping build that understanding. It's now more than 20 years since Keating reminded us all that if Australia does not succeed in Asia, it will not succeed anywhere. And the Gillard government's Australia in the Asian Century White Paper was absolutely right when it noted that Australia is located in the right place at the right time in the Asian region in the Asian century. And as I've said earlier, for Australia to get it right with Asia, we do have to get it right with China. Getting it right with China is a task Labor is willing to take on, just as we have in the past. We approach our relationship with China confidently. Our approach is deliberate and measured, aiming to advance the relationship and dealing with difficulties when they arise. And of course, we conduct our relationship with China not at the expense of any other relationship. We don't see it in binary terms, but in a network of relationships that we pursue on the basis of a clear understanding of what our national interests are. For you, as members of the ACBC, engagement with China is a day-to-day reality. It is Labor's aim to support and facilitate that engagement, and this is what Labor's approach to foreign policy is all about, a confident diplomacy reflecting intelligence and tact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Penny. Penny has said that she is happy to take questions, so I'll just open that up for questions. There's a question.
There's a journal at the back of the room.
Yeah, there's a roaming mic somewhere.
You're going to let the journalist take the first question?
Is that a journalist?
I think so. It looks like a yellow pass.
I waited a polite moment or two there just to see if anybody else wanted to ask. So I gave everybody the chance. David Rowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
There you go.
Penny, thank you. Look, when you, in your criticisms of the government's handling of the relationship, you rely on what are really a handful of remarks by government ministers. I want to know, do you believe that those verbal provocations by members of the government warrant the very material trade and economic responses by China, i.e. the wine and beef slowdowns? And if not, how specifically do you propose to manage the relationship in a better way when the nature of that relationship means that we can expect a disproportionate response from Chinese authorities for what are really a few isolated, out-of-place remarks?
That's not a hard question at all, is it? David, can I just refer you to my speech? I think I sought to address this. I mean, I'd make a few points. The first is, as much as possible, I do regard this as being a relationship where we should try and seek to have bipartisanship. I think that is in the national interest. I think that is in business interest. And I think I have been, and the Labor Party has been, quite careful and measured in our response to some of the government's, frankly, ill-discipline. The second point I make is there are times, as the speech outlines, where the differences will be patent and where we will have different views. The objective always is to ensure, if one is able, to ensure those differences do not become disagreements. And the third point I make in the speech is that government should try and not make things worse. And I don't think any fair-minded observer would suggest that some of those comments haven't, I think, contributed to the negative tone of the relationship. On other issues, as I said, we are, I think, very clear-eyed about the fact there will be at times differences, that Australia and China, there are times where our interests converge, at times they don't. The question, and this has always been so, the question is how one manages them.
Thank you. Further questions? Phil Honeywood.
Labor won plaudits, quite rightly so, for its Australian Asia Century White Paper. So whether it be the Australia in the Asia Century White Paper, whether it be your recent Asia policy, they're fantastic forward-looking policies. However, at the last election, Penny, of course, new Colombo Plan funding, you announced you're going to cut that in half from 100 million down to 50 million. Given that we've got so many first-in-family young Australians who are now having a fantastic offshore mobility experience, studying at universities in China, 5,000 to date, young Australians have studied at universities in China under that scholarship program. I had a debate with Andrew Lee recently. He said, well, why should Labor support middle-class welfare? Can we get some sort of bipartisanship here? It's such a fantastic program. It's winning the hearts and minds of Asian politicians and Asian communities. It's not one-way traffic into Australia. We're sending young Australians back there, and it'd be great to see some support for New Colombo.
Did you tell him that he should talk to me because it was my portfolio? Look, a few firsts first. It's all right, I really like Andrew. That was a joke. First, I don't really need convincing about the benefit of the term Colombo Plan. My father was a Colombo Plan scholar, and I wouldn't be standing here if we didn't have those if Australia hadn't offered that scholarship to him. Thank you for your comments about the Australian Asian Century White Paper. I was really disappointed that partisanship that you reference led to the government doing this kind of Orwellian thing of removing it from all government websites. I mean, you had to go to the library, I think the National Library, in order to get a copy of it. And frankly, that was ridiculous because Craig was involved in this Cabinet subcommittee, as was I, that actually, with a number of other externals, as you know, from business and academia, in developing that white paper. And one of the benefits of it was it did have that external input. It did engender a discussion in the community, which was of value itself. And there was a lot in there which was not partisan. So I did think that was extremely disappointing that the Coalition decided that it was so dreadful to have a Labor product. You couldn't even have it on a website that government hosted. In terms of the new Colombo Plan, I think there is merit in it. I think we are always, as an opposition though, we will be responsible about how we approach funding programs and whether particular design of programs maximises and optimises the benefit. And you'd anticipate that that's how I will approach it as the Shadow Minister in the lead up to the election. Is the current design and the current funding allocation going to optimise the benefit to Australians? But as a matter of principle, do I think having the words Colombo Plan is something that Australia does? Yes, I do. I grew up in a country, Malaysia, where that was, I think, everybody at the time, so I was young, that was a sort of senior in the public service, or many of the people senior in the public service or senior in government were actually Colombo Plan scholars to Australia. So, I do understand the way it resonates in the region.
Thank you.
There you go.
Further
Last
questions? I've got one at the front. Ian Wishart, Fred Hollows Foundation.
Yeah. It was Ian who said to me, I like questions.
I've seen you on Q&A, so you must
No, I
like
don't really enjoy myself on Q&A.
Oh.
I mean, it's nice talking to people, but, Tony, it's always Tony. Talking about Tony.
My question was a broader one in that, the Chinese government, with their Belt and Road Initiative, are really projecting a future, a vision for the world or the region. At the same time, in recent years, the Australian government has lowered its aid budget, it's cut back on programs. Do you think Australia is offering the world, do you think we have enough soft power to really be offering the world very much at the moment? What would you do in government?
Look, it's a really good question. And I made the point when the white paper, the foreign policy white paper came out, where in an exercise of bipartisanship, I largely offered support for that. That it's not much use talking about soft power when you cut $11 billion from Australia's development assistance programs. And that's what's happened. And we saw another $140 million, I think it was, in the last budget. And it is not a sustainable position to have the lowest level, recorded levels of development assistance as a proportion of gross national income ever, and to continue to be on a declining trajectory, and then to assert you're doing enough in your region and to project soft power in a disrupted world. So I think, development assistance, obviously there is an ethical element and a values element about the sort of world we want, and that actually if we can help fewer people be in poverty, that's inherently a good thing. But there is also a strategic point, which is we have an interest in our region. We have an interest in the Pacific particularly, and we have an interest in Southeast Asia. And being a partner in projects and development does require financial commitment. So we will obviously become more granular on this as in the lead up to the election. I've made a commitment, which you'll be pleased to know was agreed at Shadow Cabinet level, that we will commit to spending more than the government on development assistance. The quantum of that obviously will depend on the fiscal circumstances, but I would make this point. Well, I'd make 2 points. One is if we continue on the current trajectory, the proportion of gross national income we spend on development assistance continues to decline, okay, because of the way the indexation the government has imposed and what GDP is likely to be. So that is, we're on a declining trajectory. The second point I make is we actually should have bipartisanship around this. If you have the gaming in the way that we've seen, where the coalition went to the 2013 election saying no cuts, then just raided it, obviously for a whole range of other priorities or for budget reasons, that creates a level of partisanship around development, which I think is unhelpful. So the one point I would make, if you want a better approach to development assistance, is to urge bipartisanship. I would much rather this were not a partisan issue. I am going to have to go to the Senate. Thank you very much, John, and thank you to all of you for your time.
Okay, that was great. Thank you to Penny Wong, and thank you. They were excellent questions as well. So we're going to break for lunch, and we're back here at 1 o'clock with Chris Bowen.